Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to BASIC and the EVN's event on humanitarian impacts and the NPT, 1 year on from RevCon, in collaboration with IPPNW students and International Student Young Pugwash. We are really looking forward to this discussion today, and thank you to all of you for joining. Today, we're joined by some wonderful speakers, Councillor Tonie Jaquez of the Mexican MFA, Molly McGinty from IPPNW, Kseniia Pirnavskaia from the Open Nuclear Network and ISYP, and Nivedita S from the National University of Singapore Centre for International Law. I will introduce our speakers properly in a moment, but to begin, just some housekeeping. This event is in a webinar format, and we will have time for a question and answer in the last portion of the event. Please do feel free, however, to share any questions, thoughts, and comments that you might have throughout the session using the question and answer function. And at the end, if you feel comfortable turning on your camera or your mic, you'll also be able to directly ask your questions to our speakers as well. This event will be recorded, and we will shortly after share a recording on the BASIC website, just intending that it's available as a resource to anyone who might be interested in tuning later or referencing back to this session. The Emerging Voices Network is a digital network of high-potential next-generation leaders on nuclear issues who will inherit the responsibility to manage nuclear threats. In founding the EVN, BASIC's aim was to create a truly inclusive digital space in which early career voices from around the world are heard on nuclear issues. As part of our recent work, generously funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Plowshares Fund, we've focused on engaging with a broad range of significant topics and themes that impact and shape today's international security dynamics and issues. In our upcoming work, we're hoping to focus further on the topic of humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and to specifically work to platform early career voices on why it's important that the nuclear field addresses these impacts, recommendations for how, and to share their perspectives on what this can achieve and contribute to our field. As ever, we really emphasize that early career perspectives are fundamental to this conversation. And so we're really excited for today. We really wanted to have a conversation and event on the topic of humanitarian impacts, specifically within the context of the NPT. We're really thrilled to be collaborating with IPPNW students and ISYP on this. Within the NPT space, the humanitarian impacts agenda has at times been divisive, to say the least. Many NPT states are also parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and they have recently led efforts to bring the acknowledgement of humanitarian impacts to the forefront of the NPT, highlighting that it must be a fundamental part of our discussions around maintaining nuclear security, but also kind of bringing to a reminder that we should be considering our ethical responsibilities about ensuring that this is addressed. On the other hand, other NPT states have continuing concerns. They avoid engaging with this work, and some have said that it's too politicized. Others don't feel that there are tangible ways that they can participate with it. And with the ongoing war in Ukraine, others have said that there's limited capacity to be able to prioritize it within the NPT space at the moment. With the outcome of last year's RevCon and the recent kickoff of the new review cycle with PrepCon last month, we thought that it would be really interesting to dive in and try and situate the humanitarian impacts agenda within the NPT and explore what some of the obstacles, opportunities, and outcomes might be over the next few years, given the current security context that we're in. I think our speakers are going to offer some really interesting insights to this. I'm thrilled that they're all able to join us, and I look really forward to welcome each of you in the audience to participate and share your thoughts as well during the question and answers section. With that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Councillor Tonie Jaquez. Tonie is a career diplomat and member of the Mexican Foreign Service since 1994. She's the current coordinator for disarmament and non-proliferation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. And she has served as a disarmament expert and political coordinator at the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN from 2016 to 2022, and was also acting Director General for the United Nations and Deputy Director General for Disarmament at the MFA of Mexico from 2012 to 2016. She was in charge of the organization of the second conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons that took place in Nayarit, Mexico in February 2014, and has also been representative of Mexico to the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, or PANAL, in Mexico City. She has also been part of delegations of Mexico to the Conference on Disarmament, the First Committee of the General Assembly, and to other different intergovernmental meetings on disarmament, including the NPT, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Landmine Ban Treaty, and the Cluster Munitions Convention. And with that, Tonie, if it's okay, I will hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Anahita. I hope that you can hear me well. I am speaking from my phone, so I was a little bit doubtful that this was going to work. Okay, thank you so much to BASIC for having invited me, and for giving me the opportunity to remind the participants about the importance of this issue. I just want to comment briefly on a few points that we have to always have in mind. Within the NPT context, the issue at hand, or the issue that was discussed for all the years of existence of the treaty up to 2010, was who had the weapons, nuclear weapons, who could not have weapons. And even though some think that the discussion is who deserves to have them indefinitely, the issue was who cannot have weapons. So that's the purpose of the NPT. The NPT was not a venue to discuss what weapons do and what is the impact of the weapons. And this seems like a very obvious or very logical issue, but it was not. It was not a mainstream issue. It was not a logical issue until it was placed on the agenda in 2010. I wanted to emphasize this issue because sometimes it's forgotten. Now, more and more actors talk about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons as if this was something out in the open. Of course, it was part of the negotiation. It is part of the preamble of the NPT. If you look at the preamble of the NPT, it says that one of the purposes of the treaty is to avert the catastrophe, that would be imposed on mankind. But the idea of talking about the real impact of the weapons was not part of the narrative of the non-proliferation agenda. And in very few instances, we could have that talk. In fact, I remember that before 2010, the talk about the impact of nuclear weapons, especially focused on big victims, was part of the narrative of the UN discussions, but only in side events or on the corridors or the exchanges with the civil society or with the academia. And that is valid. And I am not saying that that is not important, or that it's not something that we should, ponder as important. But the states were not talking about that. Governments were not talking about that. And this was not part of a narrative of why we were, exercising or performing some activities in the non-proliferation and disarmament fora. So this is the first thing I wanted to talk about. So when the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons focus arrived to the NPT, this was a milestone. This was an important milestone. And there are many studies, there are many considerations that have already been analyzed about when this started. So I don't want to play chicken and egg in these remarks, but some say that this is the humanitarian initiative. This was not a name that was adopted from the beginning. This was the baptism of some of the scholars for this movement. But the so-called humanitarian initiative placed the issue of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons for a reason. And the reason, if you look at the statements that were delivered by the states at the NPT, first in 2013, And after the RevCon, I will refer to that in a moment. And then in the following preparatory committees in the cycle of 2015. If you look at the statement, it talks about the consideration of the consequences as the reason that underpins all disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. And this is the second thing I want to highlight. So the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons should not be looked at as a topic or as an issue that we do, but the reason why all the disarmament efforts and this non-proliferation and even the peaceful uses of the protection of the peaceful uses of nuclear energies, the energy must work well. So this is not a what, it is a why. It is a reason. And I talked about the review conference of the 2010. In that conference of the NPT, countries agreed to include some language that says that the NPT parties are concerned about the catastrophic consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And of course, that again sounded very obvious, but it was the first time that the conference of the parties of the NPT stated that as a chapeau and as a rationale for the disarmament regions, the disarmament activities. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize for the public, for our audience, is the reason why this is important. So the NPT has a review conference every 5 years, and that conference is a very important event because it gathers all the experts of each of the parties. The treaty is one example of a successful treaty in the multilateral arena because it gathers most of the countries of the world. Only 4 countries have not adhered to the treaty. Well, 5 with South Sudan, which is a country of recent creation. But it is an almost universal treaty, and all the experts of these parties gather every 5 years to review the implementation of the treaty. And there is a lot of expectation that every single time that the treaty reunites, there is going to be some sort of progress towards the implementation of all the provisions of the treaty. Sometimes this agreement cannot be reached. Anahita, in the introduction, mentioned that last year in the review conference of 2022, there was no agreement at the end of the conference. That is something that we need to consider, and we need to be worried about, certainly. But the treaty exists anyway, and all the parties have the obligation to fulfill the provisions of the treaty, no matter what, without conditionality. And I emphasize this because if you look at the preamble of the treaty, once again, and you really consider that all the provisions of the treaty and commitments and obligations must be implemented, so you are really taking steps to avert the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. So we needed to have this type of concern in written explicitly in the text to remind parties that this is a collective effort. This is not only responsibility of the nuclear weapon states. And this is the other thing that I wanted to highlight. So just again, some historical overview of the humanitarian impact initiative. So after the 2010 review conference and this milestone that I talked about considering the concern of the parties of the NPT about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, there were statements delivered by the parties with a growing number of countries adhering to them. But there were also 3 conferences between 2013 and 2014. The first one in Oslo, the second one in Nayarit, Mexico, the third in Vienna, Austria. And these conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons devoted time to discuss this issue from the technical angle, but also from a prospective angle, because we don't have the experience, fortunately, of the actual use of nuclear weapons, with the exception of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the around 2000 nuclear tests. So the experts, technical experts, needed to present some projections and some a prospective analysis of what would the impact be at the time of the detonation, but also as a global impact. And this was the new thing and the importance of these conferences, that the technical projections and the discussions considered for the first time amongst member states, with civil society and with academia, the possible impact on a global scale, not only for the country affected. And this demonstrated that even the societies that the possessors of nuclear weapons claim to defend or to ensure security with nuclear weapons might be affected. The other consideration that was very important in these conferences was the realization that security is multidimensional and that it is not reduced only to military to military security or to military consideration, and that issues such as health or protection of the ecosystems or the environment, climate change, might derail the ability of states to function well. And this was done many years before the pandemic. The pandemic of COVID-19 that we just had has demonstrated that these type of elements are also part of the security. So we should not reduce the security concerns to military concerns or to state-based concerns. The realization of this issue brought us to the conclusion that the impact of nuclear weapons on health, on ecosystems, on food security, on the possibility of displacement, and how the international community was going to respond to these effects, were concerns of the 21st century. So we were considering the impact of nuclear weapons from the point of view of the 21st century society, not as a historical issue that we should remember never to repeat again, but as a real concern about what might happen if this would happen in our lifetime again, and if that was going to be responded adequately by the international society and by the institutions we had. So that was the merit of that discussion, and that led to the conclusion, specifically in the conference in my country, in Nayarit, presided by Ambassador Juan Manuel Gómez Robledo on his responsibility. The report of that conference stated very clearly that given all this information and given all this consideration, it was time to look at the issue from a different angle. And considering also that all the other weapons of mass destruction, specifically biological and chemical weapons, had been first prohibited by an international instrument that explicitly included prohibitions of development of these weapons, of acquiring or testing these weapons. Nuclear weapons should be treated equally, and there was not an instrument yet of that kind that had been also stated before in 1996 by the International Court of Justice. And this consideration led to the statement that there was a need for an international instrument, for a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. And so the discussion of the humanitarian initiative was a point of no return. towards that treaty. And that was the basis for consideration and the discussion regarding how to include this assertion in the possible negotiation of a treaty. And after the Vienna conference in December 2014, in which the Austrian government launched a pledge to commit to negotiate this treaty, and many countries adhere to this pledge. First and foremost, the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole. In January 2015, the negotiations of the ban treaty were set into force and ended or could be concreted in 2017. But I wanted to, in this very, very quick overview, I wanted just to clarify as a final remark that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons initiative, or the humanitarian initiative or movement, or the way you want to call it, this process of highlighting that this is the rationale for focusing on the good functioning of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and for attention to victims, and making disarmament and non-proliferation a human, or considering this issue with a human-centered approach for the first time, if you want to call it like that. It is not the same as the process of the ban treaty. It is the basis for that. But as I said before, and I have just reiterated, we should look at the consideration of the prevention of the consequences of nuclear weapons as the foundation of all the treaties. It was also a consideration of the consequences of nuclear weapons that brought about the CTBT. Initially, it is also part of the Tlatelolco Treaty and the other nuclear weapon-free zones. In fact, if you look at the preamble of the Tlatelolco Treaty that was negotiated, it is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean that was negotiated before the NPT. It contains in the preamble also the consideration of prevention of the destruction and the catastrophe. And so it is the same for the ban treaty. So we need to continue focusing on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and the prevention of these consequences, even though we have a treaty. We receive sometimes the question that why do you keep insisting on this issue in the NPT context? You already have a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Yeah, but we have a treaty banning nuclear weapons to cover the legal gap that existed in relation to other weapons of mass destruction. But that doesn't mean that we should not raise the concern and the prevention issue about the consequence of nuclear weapons in all the treaties. So my last comment and emphasis, and also request, would be for governments and for civil society and for academia to continue raising the issue and the responsibility to prevent these consequences, because that we cannot afford to endure this issue in the 21st century. We are now gathering ourselves in this webinar under a very clear and feasible possibility of a new detonation of nuclear weapons because of the return of the rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons, and also the banalization of the use of nuclear weapons. And we should remind ourselves that when we are talking about deterrence and the use of nuclear weapons and non-proliferation and disarmament and the impact of nuclear weapons, what we're talking about is about damaging, incinerating civilians at a mass scale, sacrificing livestock, damaging the environment, damaging the ecosystems for a long time, endangering species and crops, and endangering food security, derailing the fulfillment of the SDGs and all the other commitments related to development and to climate change. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about something that is ethereal. We're talking about a lot of damages on human beings and on all life on Earth. So the more that we think about that, we need to prevent that. And that should be the rationale and our leitmotiv for all the issues that we talk about. If you want to talk about the NPT, that is the rationale. If you want to talk about negotiating a fissile material treaty somewhere, sometime in the future, that is the reason why we need a fissile material ban. That is the reason why the CTBT needs to enter into force. And that is the reason why we need to continue strengthening and having more countries join the ban treaty. So this is not one issue or the other. This is the rationale and the foundation for everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. And I think like that reminder of the reality of what it is we're actually talking about is really fundamental. With that, I'll hand over to Molly. Molly is the program director with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Through this role, she coordinates IPPNW's work on the humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. Molly is also an advocacy coordinator with Youth for TPNW, steering committee member of the Nuclear Truth Project, and serves as one of IPPNW's representatives on ICANN's international steering group. And with that, I'll hand over to Molly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anahita, and thank you, Councillor Jaquez, for your opening remarks, which made my job much, much easier. You really covered all of the core pieces here of why we're here today and the importance of us gathering. So IPPNW's core mandate is to increase the level of knowledge and engagement on the dire humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. At IPPNW, we believe that the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons must be included in, if not central to, all discussions and forums about nuclear weapons. And the NPT is, of course, core to this belief. In IPPNW's statement delivered during last month's NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, Dr. Carlos Umano, one of our co-presidents, asserted, IPPNW remains committed to helping create a world free from the threat of annihilation by nuclear war. We call on evidence-based policymaking to be mainstay in all decisions regarding nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, placing science at the service of the people and people at the center of all discussions regarding nuclear weapons. The concept of evidence-based policymaking is crucial when we're talking about nuclear weapons, the world's most destructive weapons. The facts about nuclear weapons, their unprecedented destructive power, their massive and indiscriminate humanitarian and environmental effects, and their capacity to wipe out everything that sustains life have been extensively documented in hundreds, if not thousands, of books, journal articles, and scientific papers. What's lacking, though, is the reach and implementation of this information. With that in mind, I'm going to briefly outline what exactly we're talking about when we say the, in quotes, HINW, the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, the humanitarian initiative, all of these kind of buzzwords, take that out of the abstract. So even an average sized 100 kiloton nuclear explosion over a modern city can kill tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people immediately. We'll take Washington, D.C., the US Capitol, and a city near and dear to my heart, for example here. So if a 100 kiloton nuclear weapon was detonated over DC today, an estimated over 177,000 people could die immediately, and another 383,000 could be injured from one single weapon. Of the over 383,000 estimated people injured from the single detonation, many would have complex injuries, such as burns, traumatic wounds, broken bones from the explosion, all of which would require immediate and intensive care. But as we all know, in the case of a nuclear explosion, a meaningful medical response is not possible. In Hiroshima, 80% of the hospitals were destroyed or seriously damaged. Emergency rooms were set up in half-demolished buildings without water, sanitation, or medicines. Even if the hospital buildings and the equipment stored in them were miraculously untouched following a detonation, medical professionals would be among the dead and seriously injured, unable to help themselves or those around them. Nuclear weapons eradicate the social infrastructure required for recovery from conflict. This means roads and transportation systems, hospitals and pharmacies, firefighting equipment and communications would all lie in the rumble throughout a zone of complete destruction extending for miles. To simply put it, our cities are not equipped to handle any single use of nuclear weapons. And even with all this said, I haven't touched on the long-term effects of untreated infection or more importantly, radiation exposure, which can lead to increased rates of cancer, infertility, and other lifelong complications. Again, this is from one single weapon over a city. The casualties of a nuclear war, in which even a small fraction of today's arsenals are almost incomprehensible. Today, there are approximately 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world, again, all of which are more powerful than the bombs that caused unparalleled humanitarian damage in 1945. Studies show that a so-called limited nuclear war between any of the 9 nuclear armed states would not only harm those in the targeted cities, but would severely disrupt the global climate and agriculture for decades following, leading to billions of people worldwide at risk of starvation. And as horrific as the war zone I described above might be, with tens of millions of direct immediate fatalities, the regional death toll would be dwarfed in the coming months and years by starvation deaths all around the world. Famine could result for a third of the Earth, even from a war using less than 3% of the global nuclear arsenal. And that's a war between any of the 9 nuclear armed states, all of which have fallible leaders who are not controlled always by reason and logic, and by machines which are not always, cannot always be kept under control. The thousands of nuclear weapons possessed by the US and Russia could bring about a nuclear winter, destroying essential ecosystems on which life depends. This madness, again, is in the hands of just a few leaders. And this is a sobering reality, and it's one which I'm sure many, if not all of us on this call, have heard before. And while we've all heard this grim picture, it's essential that we mind ourselves and decision makers alike of the dire impacts. The humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons offer space for each of us, regardless of background or area of interest, to engage in earnest with the NPT and related regimes. By moving nuclear weapons out of the abstract, we open the door for decision-making based on fact, not symbolic measures of security, deterrence, and false promises of safety. Now, what does this mean for the NPT? How can we advocate for, what can we advocate for within the NPT regime to strengthen it during this especially dangerous time? For one, states parties which have actively sought to bring about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons to and central to the NPT regime must continue to do so, as Councillor Jaquez said so clearly. These states include, but are not limited to, Mexico, Austria, and Kazakhstan, have already set the foundation for the future of the NPT. These states and others have also opened the way for the implementation of Article 6 via the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW. Member states to the NPT must meaningfully engage with the CTBTO, the TPNW regime, nuclear weapons-free zones, and other related entities. The engagement with a regime such as the TPNW can be as simple as engaging with TPNW leaders, observing the upcoming second meeting of states parties to the TPNW, or as full-fledged as joining the treaty, which I will say I am an optimist at heart, so I believe that will happen. Again, responsible decision-making must rely on evidence. The lived experiences of Hibakusha, decades worth of science supporting the catastrophic impacts of nuclear weapons, underscore the urgent need to eliminate nuclear weapons before they eliminate us. The NPT, as the cornerstone of disarmament, must meet the moment and join the growing number of states implementing their own obligations. Waiting for the perfect security framework is not an option. In the same vein, states parties can and should host a humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons conference, or at the very least, host a comprehensive briefing during or preceding the next PrepCom or review conference. This was successfully done preceding the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, and it grounded the week's discussion in reality. By engaging a variety of stakeholders, including policy experts, climate scientists, affected communities, and civil society, states parties can make informed decisions on policy. Through all of the aforementioned points and beyond, the NPT review cycle must continue to engage civil society throughout the process, most notably young professionals. Bringing in new voices will bring fresh ideas and new life to a regime which is failing to meet the complex needs of the 21st century. Young leaders should have ample opportunity to input directly into civil society statements, remain present in bilateral meetings, serve as experts during side events, and whenever possible, join the official delegations of states parties. And this is a call-in to civil society leaders more than young professionals themselves. Civil society must put funding and resources into educating, uplifting, and working alongside young leaders. To any young leaders on this call, or even to the mentors of young leaders, one small piece of advice is to take advantage of any young professional and campaigning groups possible. The Emerging Voices Network, for example, offers unique opportunities for peer-to-peer dialogue and conversations with some of the leading disarmament experts. Campaigning groups like Youth for TPNW, which I'm a part of, gives young people, regardless of background, the ability to connect with like-minded people from around the world. Growing these relationships from the start is extremely important to our continued work together. So to finish out my remarks and to pass it on to the other speakers, the NPT regime is at a crossroads with an indefinite extension, failed review conferences underway, and the most recent PrepCom ending with no final outcome document. The state's parties can either decide to embrace the evidence we know about the catastrophic impact of these weapons and collaborate with states parties and civil society to map out a path to full and complete implementation, or it can continue to veer on the current path towards irrelevance at best and a catastrophic nuclear war at worst. In any case, the current status quo, which does not actively account for the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, is putting all of us and future generations at risk. When you look at the evidence and you look at what's at stake, there is no other alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was really, really interesting, especially I think that reminder of, facts, what we're dealing with here is a reality and it's fact-based. And also the call to those who are in positions to be able to facilitate early career involvement. It's not just amongst us that we're talking to, it's everyone in the field. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Kseniia Pirnavskaia, who is a Deputy Director of the International Student Young Pugwash and a research consultant for the Open Nuclear Network, a program of One Earth Future. Prior to joining ONN, she worked with the NEREC, KAIST, CTBTO, VCDNP, the Peer Center, and the Career Policy for the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Her MSc dissertation at KAIST explored the nuclear justice mechanisms for communities affected by nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands and Kazakhstan. And with that, I'll hand over to Kseniia. Thank you.
Thank you, Anahita. And before I start, I really want to say thank you to BASIC for organizing such an initiative and to inviting us all to speak. It's a really great honor to be in this amazing lineup of speakers. Very honored. So in my remarks today, I'll try to highlight several things, a lot to cover. And first, I'll try to talk a little bit about how the humanitarian consequences agenda have been addressed during the RevCon in 2022 and the PrepCom in 2023. And I also talk about the role of the civil society. And then I'll try to highlight more on the CTBTO's influence on this agenda and how the CTBT and CTBTO can actually elevate the humanitarian impacts agenda in the NPT review cycle, but also just generally. I'll also mention how Ukraine affects this discussion, and I'll finish my remarks with the role of younger generation and emerging experts in that particular topic. So starting with the overview of the humanitarian agenda in the current review cycle. So while Review Conference of 2022 and PrepCom in 2023 have made certain strides in addressing these concerns, the humanitarian impacts concerns, the progress remains modest and in the larger scope of our discussion. When I was preparing for today's remarks, I tried to scan the different statements that were delivered by states or organizations, and it's important to note that the draft outcome document of the RevCon 2022, although it was not adopted, contemplated acknowledging efforts toward victim assistance and environmental remediation resulting from nuclear weapons use and testing. So I think this is a very big growth from 2010 when it was first mentioned, and I think the humanitarian agenda back in 2010 was kind of tied more to peaceful uses rather than, for example, disarmament agenda within the review cycle. So I think this is one of the changes that is notable in the recent meetings. So while the final documents hadn't been adopted during both meetings, the discussion itself is subtle, but yet a very positive change in tone and acknowledging that the nuclear activities like the use and testing have lasting consequences for communities and ecosystems. During the RevCon, more than 14 countries and international bodies such as International Committee of the Red Cross and also various youth initiatives, they have taken the initiative to highlight this humanitarian environmental aspects of testing via their statements and side events and exhibits, which I think is a really notable change as well. And this did not happen during the NPT RevCon. This happened during the TPNW conference in Vienna. But we also see how certain states that are, for example, within NATO or even host nuclear weapons like Germany, they start expressing an interest towards the dialogue within this agenda, within the humanitarian impacts agenda, which signals a cautious shift in policy discourse and policy interests, which I think non-nuclear weapon states that advocate for this agenda should take into consideration and work with nuclear weapon states or states under the nuclear umbrella more. During the PrepCon, so PrepCon 2023 has also shown the continued discussion and mentions of humanitarian agenda, even though the summary document, which was not included officially, called for greater consideration of victim assistance, environmental remediation. And there was also, I think, an improved language compared to RevCon on engaging with survivors, because there was a separate clause on engaging with survivors and their vital role in raising awareness about the horrible consequences of nuclear testing and nuclear weapons use. So I see these as positive changes. Yet these discussions still tend to be overshadowed by security-centric concerns and procedural issues, as it happened during the PrepCon 2023. And more importantly, of course, opposition to the TPNW among certain states, which happen to be key stakeholders. This also poses a challenge to meaningful discourse on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use in testing. So that needs to be the states, I think, should find a balance between how to navigate the discussion between the TPNW and NPT without playing a game of whether it belongs to this agenda or that agenda, because I think this is all about the same thing, and we should not alienate certain agendas just because they first were mentioned in the other context. And I think when we talk about humanitarian impacts, it's very important to mention the involvement of civil society and affected communities, because as seen in the side events and exhibits, their involvement is laudable. These voices bring to the table lived experiences and ground truth that are otherwise missing from high-level debates, and this is something that we need to continue on doing. So on the CTBT and CTBTO, which is very dear to my heart. So building on the limited yet very meaningful progress on the humanitarian IPEX agenda within the NPT framework, I think it's really essential to consider synergies with other international instruments. And CTBT and CTBTO, they offer the perfect opportunity for further strengthening both agendas. Firstly, in the area of capacity building, for example, the CTBT's monitoring and verification mechanisms, they are highly sophisticated, involving scientific expertise of really high level. So there is really a compelling case for developing national expertise in states affected by nuclear testing with the help of the CTBT. And CTBTO has already been doing such work with Kazakhstan, for example, but I'm sure it could be extended to other affected communities as well in other affected countries. Secondly, international support. The humanitarian consequences of nuclear testing need to be consistently highlighted, not only during the NPT RevCon or other multi-stakeholder platforms, but also during bilateral meetings and international addresses, incorporating the stories of survivors into CTBTO conferences. Thirdly, on the topic of research, CTBT's primary focus is monitoring, so it also has the capacity to conduct actionable research that can help those communities. And I think sharing the relevant research with communities affected by nuclear testing could be helpful. And fourth, fourth and the last is that CTBT can include the youth from affected communities in their various youth initiatives. And I think that would be a great way to achieve nuclear justice, at least for younger generation. So on Ukraine question, I think the conflict in Ukraine brings really kind of a twofold influence on humanitarian agenda within the NPT review cycle. On one hand, I think the conflict really, especially in its proximity to the Euro-Atlantic region, really heightens the fear about the human security and welfare. So it really drives the development of these discussions even during the NPT review cycle. But at the same time, the problem that there is also the risks that we may not achieve the necessary compromise or unanimity for adopting critical documents like final summaries or final documents during the review cycle because of this tension. So this needs to be worked on by the states of interest. And to wrap up my remarks, I really wanted to comment on the involvement of youth and emerging experts in this agenda. It is often said that we are, as youth, the leaders of tomorrow. I think if we talk about humanitarian agenda, we as emerging experts are the leaders of today, because I see more research, more initiatives, more interesting, engaging projects that highlight this crucial agenda much more compared to the official review cycle or any other conferences. So I think youth really drives this agenda further, and gives it the second breath, kind of. And here I just wanted to highlight a couple of initiatives that I think really doing a great job. So Youth Fusion have their great Nuclear Stories project, where people are able to share their stories, including those who have been affected by nuclear testing or other injustices related to nuclear weapons. I myself have a podcast on YouTube, Nuclear Pep Talk, and I've conducted a couple of interviews with the representatives of those communities. Such organizations as Reverse the Trend, Marshallese Educational Initiative, Basics, Emerging Voices Network, International Student, and Pugwash. I think these initiatives ask tough questions and share the hard answers with various audiences in an engaging way. And this is what I think we're supposed to continue to do. And I hope more of us will come to this field, to this topic, to drive the agenda further and make it not only as a side topic, but really, as Tonie was saying, a critical and foundational topic that actually makes us work further on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kseniia. I know we're a little tight on time, so I'll jump straight into introducing Nivedita, who is a Basic Emerging Voices Network member and has co-chaired the working group on nuclear weapons issues and climate change in our last policy cycle on de-siloing existential threats. She's a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Centre for International Law, where she researches all things nuclear law and policy at the international and regional ASEAN levels. Her particular area of interest has been issues at the intersections between nuclear and other areas, including climate change and environment, maritime security, and more. Thank you so much, Nivedita.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction and for Basic for inviting me and organizing this seminar on a very important topic. I should also say these are my own personal views and not that of my institution. So the working group that Anahita mentioned focused on the dual threat of nuclear weapons and climate change and the danger of inaction. So I'm going to start off by highlighting some of our research observations and findings. Firstly, that there is a mutually reinforcing relationship between nuclear weapons and climate change, and there needs to be a concerted effort and action to holistically address this dual threat to try and break some of the patterns influencing these dynamics. So our research looked at the relationship between nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and climate change to demonstrate how the fragility in both the nuclear and climate domains can impact global security, stability, and development, while also heightening existing or creating vulnerabilities. So in doing so, we focus this relationship in three different aspects: how nuclear deterrence impacts climate change, how climate change can act as a threat multiplier, and how nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and climate change interact. I'm not going to, in light of the time that I have, I'm not going to go into each of these findings in detail, but I would encourage you to read the policy paper for more details. But I just want to highlight that one of our key recommendations from that exercise was the promotion, universalization, and adherence to the global non-proliferation and disarmament regime and its associated instruments and frameworks need to be a priority for all states to ensure that the risks posed by nuclear weapons and climate change remain in check. And this is something I just want to emphasize here, particularly in light of our discussion on the NPT and the CTBT and all these associated regimes here. The NPT RevCon has previously recognized the immediate, midterm, and long-term consequences of nuclear weapon detonations, inter alia on health, environment, biodiversity, infrastructure, food security, climate, development, social cohesion, global economy, that all of these are interlinked and would not be constrained by national borders, but have regional or global effects, and that a nuclear war could even threaten the survival of humanity. As such, addressing the dual threat of climate change and nuclear weapons undoubtedly will minimize the humanitarian consequences and contribute to furthering the humanitarian impacts agenda. Another aspect I want to highlight is that recent years have witnessed a dramatic increase in the scope and extent of advocacy for climate change at both the governmental and grassroots levels, providing invaluable lessons for nuclear campaigners in effective mass action. Now, nuclear disarmament activism, while less pervasive, has been around for decades, but is steadily increasing in influence. Despite the interdependencies across these two realms, they operate in silos without any significant cross-fertilization of activities and resources. So a concerted effort toward bridging climate change and disarmament advocacy efforts can serve to strengthen their connection in the pursuit of minimizing their mutually catastrophic effects and overall revitalizing work towards the disarmament pillar of the NPT. At the last NPT RevCon, the conference did recognize and highlight the vital importance of educating and empowering individuals of all generations regarding the dangers of nuclear weapons and the imperatives to reach a world without nuclear weapons, including the risks and humanitarian consequences associated with nuclear weapons. And in this regard, following the same trend as Molly and Kseniia, I really want to make a shout out to Basic's Emerging Voices Network here, which provides a platform for early career professionals, and these also being part of the stakeholder class needed for collective action in furthering the humanitarian impacts agenda. And I do encourage everyone who do qualify to participate in it, because it has definitely created an impact on me as a human. So with that, I'm gonna end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, the little shout out for the EVN from everyone. And I think just kind of bringing in the other existential threats that are so pressing at this time is really, really helpful to this conversation as well. I am really keen to be able to give some time to our audience to ask some questions. So I'm going to dive right into the Q&A. There is a question from Emma Saunders. The kinds of language used in nuclear weapons discourse seems to create a disconnect between discussions on nuclear weapons and their catastrophic impacts, e.g. the persistence of Cold War reminiscent language in strategic documents, gendered terms such as continuous deterrence, strategic stability, etc. Even small subtleties and nuances of language used can make a huge difference in shaping narratives. Do you think the introduction of the TPNW is helping to reshape the language used in nuclear weapons discourse? And if yes, how can we transfer this progress to NPT proceedings? And I'm happy to also let anyone jump in on that.
Thank you for the question. It's a tricky question because yeah, the TPNW has changed the parameters of the discussion, and we are not talking only about the possession of nuclear weapons or how to stop some actors from acquiring nuclear weapons, but we are talking about weapons that have been prohibited by a group of member states. But I want to continue and to reiterate what I said before, but also what has been also highlighted by the very good presentations that we have heard. The humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons must be highlighted in all the treaties, not only in the NPT, as a foundational tool, as a rationale for prevention. Otherwise, it becomes a contention or a contentious issue. It is difficult. There are a lot of resistance points, especially from the point of view of the possessors, of course, of nuclear weapons, but also the countries under the so-called nuclear umbrella, or the ones that consider the nuclear weapons as an important asset for international security and to protect security. This is an issue that is not talked about a lot. There are 116 countries, for example, on their nuclear weapon-free zones. So these countries have already rejected the nuclear option with a legally binding instrument, with a legally binding commitment. And of those 116, 69 are under the TPNW and have adhered to the prohibition. The rest of the world, it's not that they support nuclear weapons, but many of them, even if they don't have nuclear weapons, still regard nuclear weapons as valuable for international security. And they don't want to talk about the consequences or what weapons do because of that, because they think that it is a necessary evil to maintain strategic stability. So the challenge is not how to incorporate language regarding the consequences. Of course, that is an important issue of what we try to do in all the fora, but also how to challenge the notion that nuclear weapons have some value for international security. Because as we have seen historically, they are part of the problem more than part of the solution. And the vast majority of countries in the world don't have nuclear weapons and will not acquire them. So this is not a valid entry point for them or a doctrinal issue of value for most of the countries of the world.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Alex Elliott, who says, how can humanitarian impact initiatives get funding, and how do victims of the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons get funding allocated to them for medical purposes? If anyone would like to jump in again, feel free.
I'll try to be very short in this one. So this is a very complicated question and a very controversial one when it comes to financial assistance and financial help. I think on the first part of the question, how humanitarian impact initiatives get funding, I think now it has become a little bit more common to get funding from a bigger nuclear related funders on these topics. And for example, APLN is doing a really great job on highlighting the victims of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and they even filmed sponsor the videos that Marshallese can film about their nuclear legacy. So here and there, I think more and more civil society representatives get funding for that, even though it's still not, it's really hard to do. And the second part of the question is a little bit different. It depends on the country. So each country has a very different rule on how rules and agreement, how victims can get an assistance. So for example, US and Marshall Islands, they have a compact of free association where there is a regulation on how Marshallese can get help from that. In Kazakhstan, for example, again, there is a law that that regulates on how people can get financial or help for health issues or just for the life. So it really depends on the country, and but again, in every country, this is a very difficult and very controversial topic, and I think usually victims are not really happy with how it is done.
Thank you so much. I know that we're short on time, but if it's okay with our speakers, we do have 1 or 2 more questions for us to quickly respond to. Amazing. So Tristan Norman has asked, what are the best ways to promote engagement with youth climate activists on the need for nuclear disarmament and de-siloing the climate crisis and the nuclear threat? Climate awareness is quite strong for youth, but rarely is it connected with the need for greater nuclear awareness. How should one leverage shared interests?
Thank you, Tristan. And I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of how is it you can leverage existing activism and existing advocacy efforts that are taking place and use it to leverage shared interests. And I think one way to do that is to try and understand the interlinkages between climate change and nuclear weapons, which is what the last policy cycle the working group tried to do. And I would caution that it is not an in-depth effort, it's just a start. And we are hoping that that would inspire more youth and more research communities to take up this topic and to try and explore this area a lot more. Because I think at the start, when we started the research, I don't think we realized that it was a two-way street. And I don't think we realized that there is just so many interlinkages and it happens in so many different levels. I mean, just for an example, I think one topic, I think one of the previous questions talked about financing. So just on the finance aspect of it, given the massive running costs for global nuclear arsenals and the resources currently being used to maintain and increase them, if you just think about all these resources being diverted to climate-related programs to address climate change, I mean, of course, assuming the political will is present, then the climate change gets benefits. So this could be something that the climate youth activists could be interested in, some way for them to get interested in the nuclear aspect of it. And similarly, in this current climate, pardon the pun, climate change is becoming a more acceptable narrative where the role of nuclear energy in contributing to climate goals has been lauded and, and more discussed. And it has opened the path to further conversations where you can bring in, and let's not forget, the third pillar of the NPT is the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So that's another way to try and bring in the conversation and to highlight the interlinkages and start this conversation.
Thank you so much. I think you have also hit the nail on the head with that response. One final question. Why is the CTBT and humanitarian impacts agenda not automatically connected within the NPT?
Yeah, I'm sure Tonie has much more to say about that, but my take on that from my experience with working with the CTBTO is that they say it's really outside of the CTBTO's mandate, and because CTBTO is more of a technical monitoring organization, so they're not really tied with those communities or have any have a mandate or have a mandate to engage with them. But I think that speaking about like diplomatic marketing, even like these two agendas go hand in hand together and should be. I don't like, I keep asking the same question to myself all the time, but I think these two agendas should be tied at least verbally during the conferences, because CTBT is banning something that has affected so many people in so many bad and horrible ways, and I think these two agendas should be reinforced regardless of the fact that it's outside of the mandate of the official technical mandate of the CTBTO.
Yeah, just very quickly, the NPT context, the NPT conferences did not address humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons until 2010. That is the issue. This is in the whole spectrum of the consideration of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. This is a recent issue. And it depends on the will of the parties to continue raising this issue as a central issue, as a central item of the agenda. And we have addressed this need from different perspectives. So, but one that is very effective, and that has been very effective, I think, in my view, from in the last 15 years, is that. This is the preamble of the treaty. It is inside the consideration of the NPT to talk about the prevention, the consideration of the catastrophe, but also with regards to CTBT and with other treaties, these were part of the nuclear disarmament commitments adopted in 2000, the entry into force of the CTBT. And even if countries argue that the CTBT has not entered into force, so we should not bring the technical issue into the NPT agenda, or as Kseniia was saying, the other way around, we should not talk about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in the CTBT because it's a technical forum. We can always argue whatever, not to talk about one issue. So it is up to the delegations to decide to talk about issues that are important, and even if the venue might not be the correct one, we can start creating some communicating vessels and not continue to work in silos. What I wanted to say is that one of the most damaging issues for the multilateralism, especially in nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, is consider that this issue is not connected to other issues in the United Nations agenda. For example, development, for example, climate change, for example, gender issues and assistance to development, etc. So working in silos is not productive. It is part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tonie and Kseniia, for that. I know that I accidentally missed Molly's raised hand, so I'd like to give you the chance to just hop back in and respond to the previous question, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you. I'll be very, very brief because I know that we're over time. I think that the answer was answered wholly, and I think that Tristan's question actually had the answer within it, which is to get ourselves out of these silos and to work alongside climate activists. And that means showing up for their events if you were on the more activist campaigny side, and if you were on the more academia side of this work, to also include that in your academia and in your research, talk about what these intersections look like, and to show up for one another, because what we're talking about here are the twin existential threats that don't exist separate from one another. They multiply one another and they feed into one another, and I think that's an incredibly important part to this work that we do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. And I think with that, I will wrap up there. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for what has been a really interesting, insightful, and thought-provoking discussion. I'm really, really grateful to each of you for your time. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for this event today in the audience. I hope that you also enjoyed it. As a reminder, this event will be recorded and shared on BASIC's website. And just as a final wrap up, that if you are an early career professional who's joined us today and you're interested in the conversation that we've had and have some of your own ideas and opinions on how we can address the humanitarian impacts agenda within the NPT, I'd like to remind you all that the Emerging Voices Network at BASIC has now opened its call for applications to become a member. And as part of this, we're launching a new policy cycle which you can sign up to participate in. And that's focused on exactly this topic, strengthening the humanitarian impacts agenda within the NPT. We will link some further information about that in the chat below. And I'd also really encourage you to look into International Student Young Pugwash, IPPNW Students, and Youth for TPNW. There's a number of organizations and spaces in which you can get involved and you can contribute. And we would love to have you get involved. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us as well if you have any questions. But with that, thank you so much to everyone. Thanks for a great event. Bye.